Welcome to Upterra's brief introduction to finding the data to build a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. A greenhouse gas emissions inventory, broken down by the three scopes, provides an organization with insights into the types and sources of those emissions. In order to build an inventory, an organization will have to identify and collect a few key pieces of information about its operations. Before gathering any emissions data, it's helpful to identify and gather some preliminary data about your organization. First, it will be necessary to identify all the facilities owned and leased by your organization. For each facility, identify the type of facility, such as office or warehouse or factory, whether it's owned or leased, its address, square footage, and potentially its operating dates. Your company's facilities management function is likely to have this data. Second, it's helpful to know the total count of employees and which facilities they're associated with. Generally, this does not need to include contractors, and an organization's human resources department is likely to have this data. And lastly, it's important to identify the organization's relevant subsidiaries, as well as dates and information about recent or potential mergers, acquisitions, or divestitures. This kind of activity could affect the balance of the inventory. With this key information identified, let's briefly review where an organization could find the data to build an emissions inventory. We'll break this down according to the three emission scopes. To inventory Scope 1 emissions, there's a few things you'll need. Monthly utility invoices for your facilities, specifically for combustible fuel usage like natural gas. Fuel records for fleet vehicles, aircraft, generators, or furnaces controlled or owned by your operations. This would include purchase records, receipts, invoices, odometer data from vehicles if applicable, and more. And maintenance records for HVAC units, if available, to show refrigerant usage. Having these broken down in standard units of fuel and by facility will be key. And if you've done any previous Scope 1 inventories, that would also be helpful. Let's see some examples of Scope 1 data collection. Say an organization's facility uses natural gas for heating, an example of stationary combustion. For that facility, an organization should identify the amount of natural gas consumed by month. This can likely be identified through utilities invoices available to the finance and/or facilities management functions. Similar stationary combustion scenarios include running a diesel backup generator or using a forklift that consumes propane. For both, you should identify the amount of diesel or propane consumed each month. Data should be available from the finance and/or facilities management functions. Mobile combustion data can be either fuel consumed or miles traveled, for vehicles including owned or leased corporate vehicles, as well as corporate jets. The finance department or fleet management function is likely to have this data. HVAC and other systems may use refrigerants, which may be recharged on some basis. Key data for this includes the amount of refrigerant used for a given period and the specific type of refrigerant. An organization's HVAC vendor may be able to provide this information. And while it's not shown here, a Scope 1 inventory would also incorporate data from fire suppression systems and the purchase and release of industrial gases, if that's notable to your company. Now for Scope 2 emissions. The key items here include monthly electricity utility invoices for each of your facilities, as well as any steam or district heating. And you'll want this in terms of total megawatt hours consumed by facility per year and by month if available. If you use renewable energy, data for that should include the total megawatt hours consumed by facility per year and by month if available. And lastly, make sure you have the location of each facility and include reference to any previous Scope 2 inventories. So let's see some examples of Scope 2 data collection. For each owned or leased facility consuming electricity, an organization should identify the electricity utility provider and the amount of electricity consumed each month. This can likely be identified through utilities invoices available to the finance and/or facilities management functions. The same data should be identified for any steam, chilled water, or district heating consumed. Therms are the standard unit for steam, while ton hours are typical for chilled water. Let's take a moment to talk about Scope 3, which tends to be more complicated than Scopes 1 and 2, but for many organizations represents the largest portion of emissions. There are 15 categories for Scope 3 emissions, and we're just showing some of them here. Purchased goods and services represents emissions arising from the products and services that support your business operations. Ideally, an organization will identify the amount of money spent by each supplier, broken into spending groups. Business travel is another Scope 3 category that can include hotel stays, flights, rental cars, use of Uber, and others. For this category, organizations should collect data on travel type, dates, distance, location, and cost. The downstream transportation and distribution of sold products is another category, encompassing third-party logistics services used. Such activities can be reflected in data including total mileage by transport type, or with certain spending data. And Scope 3 also includes emissions arising from the waste generated from an organization's operation, including third-party waste disposal and treatment services, such as recycling, waste to landfill, and composting services. Key data here would include the weight, material, type, and disposal methods. So remember, when conducting an inventory, an organization will need to identify different data sources depending on the scope and type of emissions. Typically, this data should be reported in standard units for each facility and for each month. Oftentimes, the finance or facilities functions will have the needed data. Thanks for watching.